Happy afternoon, everyone. I'm very, very glad to introduce Susan and John from Achieving the Dream. Fredonia's had the opportunity over the past 6 weeks to work with this group and developing some really great course content for our online environment. And I'm really grateful to them for agreeing to come in and share with SUNY Wider through the SUNY Summit. So I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves and get us started on the content they have prepared.
Thanks so much, Lisa. It's great to see you. It's great to see you, Alex, as well. I'm Susan Adams, and I'm the Associate Director of Teaching and Learning at Achieving the Dream. And I'm here with my colleague, John Iuzzini.
Hi, everyone. I'm John, Director of Teaching and Learning at Achieving the Dream. Great to be with you and great to be back virtually in New York. I know some of you, I see some familiar names on here. I'm a graduate of SUNY Albany and worked at Monroe Community College for several years before coming to ATD in 2016. So great to be back with you today.
Great. So we're excited for today because we have some opportunities for you to do some deep dives into some elements around culturally responsive teaching and learning. And so our intention today is to set a stage for us to do some co-creation together and also get ideas and generated and idea sharing. So we're going to kind of talk at you for a bit, but we're also going to give you an opportunity to produce some content and some ideas together collectively. We're actually going to be sharing a Padlet towards the end of this session where we're going to get to do some real idea sharing and then have an asset at the end for all of us to kind of take home. I like to call it sort of a digital goodie bag that we're going to co-create together. So we've already introduced ourselves. I'm Susan, and this is John, who's leading with me. And we wanted to also give you a little bit of background on Achieving the Dream. So John, if you want to speak to who we are and what we do.
Sure, thanks, Susan. So we are a national network, a nonprofit organization. We're based in Silver Spring, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. and Portland, Oregon. And that's where Susan and I are coming to you from today. I'm in the D.C. area and Susan is on the West Coast. Our network now is approaching 300 institutions, community colleges, technical colleges, and tribal colleges and universities from all around the country. And our mission is to support the students at these institutions who are particularly the most underserved students and work with them to realize substantial value from their post-secondary experience and their earned credentials. And in turn, our theory of change is that strengthens communities. Our community colleges and technical colleges and tribal colleges are all about their localness, right? These are different kinds of institutions from four-year institutions. But we also know that the work we do is really relevant at four-year institutions also. We all have a mission around student success ultimately. And so the work that Susan and I are doing in our teaching and learning area at ATD, we know is highly relevant across all of higher ed. We do this work as a full-time staff of nearly 60 people, and then we have part-time consultant coaches all around the country, people who either are currently now or were recently college presidents, provosts, vice presidents of instruction, faculty developers, leaders of centers for teaching and learning, faculty, department chairs, deans, and so on. So that's who we are. And the next slide will just give you a sense of how we approach our work. So we have this institutional capacity framework. There are 7 capacity areas. You know, what we're talking about today primarily on the surface is about teaching and learning and equity, those 2 areas. But our theory of change is that colleges and universities really need to build capacity in all of these areas in order to create a culture that is truly student-focused and student-centered. And so that's the work we do through our coaching, through our technical assistance, by bringing subject matter experts to campus, by engaging colleges in grant-funded work. Some of you may have been involved over the past few years in our work to create OER degree pathways at community colleges, nearly 40 institutions all across the country. We've done work as well on engaging adjunct faculty in the student success movement. We have an initiative right now with the Every Learner Everywhere Network on the implementation of adaptive courseware in gateway courses. Susan?
Great. Thanks, John. So our intended goals today is that you'll walk away having explored how to position cultural knowledge as a cognitive tool in digital classrooms. We'll be diving into Zaretta Hammond's framework, which I was delighted to see Whitney Kilgore at the plenary yesterday, or actually I guess it was Monday, speak to that framework as well. So we're going to dive deeper today. We're also going to visualize strategies that create an equitable digital learning environment. So we want to speak to the digital learning spaces that we're all now beholden to, whether we like it or not. And some of us have been doing it for a very long time. So we're excited to connect all of us together in this framework to, again, co-create some knowledge today. So we're going to start off with what is culturally responsive teaching. It's one of many equity moves that gets at the core of quality teaching. The power of culturally responsive teaching is that it invites and makes room for students' culturally based learning styles and experiences in the learning environment, content, and process. We like to, quote Geneva Gay, a thought leader for equity in higher education, who describes culturally responsive teaching as using the cultural knowledge, prior experiences, and performance styles of diverse students to make learning more appropriate and effective for them. And it teaches to and through the strengths of the students. This is one of my favorite images. This is coming from Zaretta Hammond, who defines culturally responsive teaching as an educator's ability to use a student's cultural funds of knowledge, a culturally bound prior knowledge, as a scaffold to new concepts or content in order to promote deep learning. So it centers around the cognitive aspects of teaching and learning and focuses on improving educational outcomes for marginalized students. It's helpful if we talk about social identity wheel. John?
Thanks, Susan. So some of you may be familiar with the concept of intersectionality as we think about all the different identity backgrounds that our students and that we bring to the table, and how these different identities come together to create relative senses of advantage and disadvantage, relative privilege versus disadvantage. I think it helps to better understand the experiences of our students, some who come from underserved backgrounds, some who come from more privileged backgrounds. And I think what's really important about the wheel and about the way the identities are laid out here is that in any given moment, in any given classroom space or other learning space, some of these identities for us as educators and for our students, some identities are going to be more salient and less salient, depending on the dynamics in that moment. And so this is something that we always work with faculty to be really aware of. Sometimes we're not so aware of our own identities, the privileges that we bring into these spaces. Our students may be aware of their own identities or they may not, but we know that the way these identities surface really impacts the experience we have in engaging our students in learning. We also know that as we think about this culturally responsive teaching framework, there are a few key components. In a couple of minutes, I'm going to put a link to our Achieving the Dream Teaching and Learning Toolkit into the chat. It's a free resource that's available on our website. We've been using it with thousands of educators across the country since we published it in September. And you'll see in there a lot of really helpful resources that will help you and the faculty you work with to think about how you can embrace these different pedagogical practices in all kinds of classrooms, face-to-face, hybrid, virtual, and so on. But there are four key components here in how culturally responsive teaching impacts student success. It helps us to help our students to build on their prior knowledge. It helps and understands that there is more than one way of knowing. And I think for many of us in the graduate training we had in our respective disciplines, my background is in psychology. I know that many of us in how we were trained, we're not always reinforced to think about how there's more than one way of knowing. But our students need for us to embrace that perspective. This approach encourages students to embrace their culture to fuel their learning. And it also highlights students' strengths and empowers them. So this is an asset-based approach, and it calls on us to do away with the entrenched narratives that we often bring because they've been reinforced for us for so long in our academic training and our careers as educators. We often bring a deficit approach. And so the culturally responsive philosophy and framework encourages us and in fact requires us to do away with those entrenched narratives around deficit approaches and instead embrace asset-based approaches. When we think about culturally responsive teaching as a specific pedagogical approach, we're also thinking about constructivist approaches. And I know that some of us on this call, and actually I shouldn't say some of us because this doesn't include me, but some of you on this call actually have a background in education, a master's or doctorate in education, where you would have been more likely to learn about constructivist approaches. At ATD, we've been thinking more and more about differentiated instruction, inquiry-based approaches, things we know that K through 12 educators have long known work and are really effective, and in fact are especially effective with students from underrepresented backgrounds. But in higher ed, I think we've only really come to embrace some of these approaches in the last 10 to 15 years, those of us who don't have a background in education. And I think it's our colleagues who teach in education departments and who often teach in developmental education who have been trying to say to us for a very long time that these are the approaches we need to take up to engage our students. We're also thinking about high impact pedagogies like service learning, learning communities, writing across the curriculum, project-based learning. And we talk about each of these in chapter 1 of the toolkit.
One of the biggest challenges that we see is educators struggling with how to operationalize culturally responsive pedagogical principles into this culturally responsive teaching practice that we're amplifying today. It requires understanding the basic concepts and then learning the instructional moves associated with them. So Zaretta's framework is designed to help us do just that with the aid of neuroscience to deepen our understanding. So this simple framework organizes key areas of educator capacity building that sets the stage for helping students move from being dependent learners to self-directed independent learners. So as we design and conduct online courses for today's world and today's college student population, it's becoming more essential to engage in this culturally responsive teaching practices to ensure that disproportionately impacted groups have access to equitable learning experiences and outcomes. So really, how can we do that? So today we're going to invite you to take a deep dive into these 4 practice areas: awareness, learning partnerships, information processing, and community building. So I'm going to go a little deeper because I know that that image was a little small in terms of text, so I'm breaking it out into different slides to speak to each one and seeing how it lands for you in your practice. So awareness explores the development of our socio-political lens and consciousness and acknowledgement, or acknowledging the dynamics of our racialized society and the role that our institutions and our teaching play in perpetuating inequities. So this practice asks of us to know our own cultural biases and to understand the levels of cultures, acknowledge the socio-political context around race and language, and recognize cultural archetypes of individuals and collectivism. So it made me think a little bit more about wanting to present the concept of what is 3 levels of culture, right? So helping us to recognize that, this is a great image that does, how do we look at cultural displays in the classroom? So at the surface level, you can include authors that share the same ethnic identities as your students. Beyond the surface level, we can see the use of nonverbal communication, amount of eye contact, even in Zoom, and personal spaces in the learning environment. So giving you the opportunity to match your students' home culture with their own self-expressions, even if it's deciding to turn off their cameras. At the deepest level of cultural displays in the classroom would be learning activities that are infused with cultural practices that align and reflect the cultural values and beliefs, such as individualism versus collectivism or competition versus cooperation. So again, you know, this almost matches also with the community of inquiry. When we're thinking about being in an online space, how do we be present, right? And not just in synchronous ways, you know, when we talk about this just below the surface level of eye contact, but how can we create a welcoming environment in an asynchronous forum, for example? And we're going to speak more to that and ask you for your ideas as we move forward. Learning partnerships is about building trust to create social emotional partnership with your students and creating opportunities for that peer-to-peer connections for deeper learning. So this practice asks us to reimagine the student and teacher relationship as a partnership. It asks us to balance giving students both care and push, and helping students find the language to talk about their learning moves. And I love how Zaretta talks about it as learning moves or instructional moves. It's such an invitation for action-oriented, how can I move someone forward along a spectrum or into a spiral of development. Information processing asks us to mediate learning based on what we know about how the brain works. So this is where the neuroscience comes in. And how does the brain work with students' cultural models? So how can we provide an appropriate amount of challenge in order to stimulate that brain growth to increase what she calls intellective capacity? So intellective capacity is about having the power to understand. So intellective capacity is the increased power the brain gets to create to process complex information more effectively. And neuroscience tells us that culture plays a critical role in that process. And finally, community of learners and learning environments. So this practice focuses on creating an environment that feels socially and intellectually safe and encourages students to take risks and disrupt the notions of a culturally neutral environment. So we're asked here to create an environment that communicates care and a sense of belonging in ways that students recognize. So use of classroom rituals and routines to support a culture of learning and to make space for student voice and agency. Even the principles of restorative justice to manage conflicts and redirect behavior is one that Zaretta also amplifies here. So again, I appreciate this as all coming together in one sort of circle and placing it in that context of students, are ready for rigor and independent learning when all four of these and elements of them are put together with affirmation, instructional cohesiveness, validation, wise feedback, right? So I love that circle in the middle that kind of brings all of these four together. So now let's build our capacity by collectively taking a deep dive into how to operationalize these practices into your own practice. So I'm going to ask John to go ahead and put this link into the chat and invite you to think through, and we're just going to go right now for the first two. So the goal here is to collectively inspire each other by capturing some of the instructional moves associated with each practice, while also possibly creating new ones. So let's start with the practice of awareness and learning partnerships. And then we're going to come back and talk for a few minutes and then go back and do the second two columns. So when you visit this Padlet, you'll see awareness on the left, and then right next to it, learning partnerships. So awareness, so I've added a few practices under each one for you to comment on by selecting the comment. It just says add comment. And go ahead and add a practice that you've done or that you would like to do that illustrates this practice. Now, you may also select the plus button if you want to add an entirely new element to the practice. And we'll give you about 5 to 8 minutes to post. And then we'll come back to discuss the first two before moving on to the second two. So we'll do a little break there. And what's lovely about this is a shared open public Padlet. So we're going to be able to watch the comments as they move forward. And if anybody has any questions or technical difficulties, do let us know. There's some great stuff coming in. We'll give you another minute or two. Okay, let's come back. So John, did you have any thoughts on what's coming up, or should I begin?
How about you begin, and then I will jump in.
Okay, great. Wow, this first comment's pretty powerful. Discuss white language supremacy and its implications in grading standards and employ labor-based grading contracts. That's a big one. I've been hearing a lot of that arise around effort-based grading contracts, which is a great way to, again, get the students at the center of their own learning and really know who they are and be in a responsive stance to that. And there's a comment there going on. And as for race, how to proceed in a way that acknowledges everyone's culture and how culture, in addition to race, plays into how we work together. So again, being transparent and inviting that this is what's going on in the world and how does it play out in the context of the course. Great comments there. I see Harvard's implicit bias test with discussion as an opportunity for recognizing preference in communication or even understanding one's own biases. Asking students how they would prefer to communicate, setting boundaries, multiple means of representation, UDL, great stuff there.
You know, it's interesting, Susan. One of the things I think about as I look through the full column here, that first column on awareness, is, you know, some educators come to this work having deep background and a very comfortable amount of the vocabulary that we require to engage students around these issues, and for us to have a certain level of comfort and confidence in doing that. I think these suggestions are great, but I could see how, you know, some of the faculty we support on our campuses might be somewhat ambivalent. They're open-minded. They, at an intellectual level, realize the importance of trying to engage students in this way to center identity as a cognitive tool, but they may have some ambivalence and perhaps some fear because it's not necessarily in their wheelhouse or in their academic training. And so I think it's important to name that, to acknowledge it, to help our colleagues be comfortable with that. There is one resource I'll point you to in the appendix of our teaching and learning toolkit that I posted the link to earlier. In the appendix, there's a self-assessment that we all can do, and it was created by Brian Dewsbury at the University of Rhode Island and his colleagues, who have done really wonderful work on the use of inclusive pedagogies in STEM courses specifically. But I think what you'll see in that tool is that their work and their thinking is relevant across all areas. And so that's a helpful tool where, as educators, we can go through and think about the ways in which we're already trying to do the sorts of things that we're presenting in this session. We're already doing some of them. Sometimes we're calling it something else, or we're thinking about it in a different way. We're framing it in a different way. But that's what I'm thinking about as I look at awareness, because it's really a first key step in sorting out how these strategies are going to work effectively in our respective classrooms.
Great. Yeah, and bringing in different perspectives, right? And the assignments, you know, in here is saying at least 2 to 3 stakeholders in any given scenario, right? And looking at different perspectives there. How does this land within your cultural context is great. And learning partnerships. I'm loving a lot of these ideas. Learning contracts are so great. And, I often ask students, look at the learning course level outcomes. Which ones will you find the most challenging, and which ones might be missing for you in what you're hoping to get out of this course? Kind of having them be able to, again, contribute to the course and the content itself. Ask for students' feedback, find and share resources by and for those in underrepresented populations, walk the talk, collecting student feedback at various pivotal points during the semester, and then adjusting how we proceed accordingly. So I often call it emergent learning. How can we set a stage for there to be new learning and emergent learning? And again, that kind of co-creation of knowledge.
Thanks, Susan. I think, an important thing for us to be aware of when we think about these learning partnerships is, many students welcome the kinds of approaches that I'm seeing in the suggestions here, learning contracts, having students be engaged in the process of creating the course syllabus, the learning contracts, having them influence or choose due dates, having them help to co-create norms. For some students, though, that feels like it's totally out of left field, and it's unfamiliar, it's uncomfortable, and it is obviously disrupting the power dynamic that they may be more comfortable with. They may be more comfortable with a more traditional dynamic. And so it helps to be really transparent with students before we adopt these kinds of practices, especially the ones under learning partnerships, to be transparent and explain why we're using these practices and what we hope the impact is going to be. First, on the climate we hope it'll create in the classroom, the environment, but then second, ultimately on their success, why we think it's going to make a difference for their learning and their success in the course.
That's great, John. Yeah, super important for setting that stage again for safety and understanding, especially with some of these things that are so in many ways paradigm shifting for the students. We wanted to open it up for any questions or comments, particularly about awareness and learning partnerships, before we move on to the next two. And you're welcome to unmute or place questions in the chat.
Hi, my name's Hope Wendell, and
Hi, Hope.
hi, I just am curious, in the room of the participants, who finds that faculty are willing to hear these ideas from them in terms of trying to figure this out. In the past, I've just seen faculty as not as open to hearing how to do this. And I just am trying to think of ways in which that this can be an inclusive professional development opportunity for faculty, as opposed to many faculty who are already feeling like they're overwhelmed or they don't think that it applies to them.
I appreciate the question, Hope. So I want to make sure that we're putting it out to everyone. Do folks have ideas or suggestions from their own experience, their own practice about what works well in that dynamic with your faculty colleagues?
I think this is Alex. I think that, one has to tread carefully and be the voice that the person in front of you is ready to hear. And sometimes if you're a fire hose with stuff, it's not going to be effective. And so one of the things that I would advocate is to model behaviors and explain why, just like you just said, one should do for one's students. I think that change for and understanding, uh, it's a process, and so if people understand why, if they see some benefit, if they see some benefit for their students or some benefit for themselves in a particular change that's being advocated for, they're going to understand it better and they're going to want to do it. So I think seeing it modeled is a helpful way to help people be able to sort of incrementally start thinking about things in different ways and start considering possibilities when they turn it and look at themselves, with whatever that lens is. So I think it's a process that is kind of delicate, right? You don't want to be a fire hose with anyone. It's not going to work.
Exactly. I have noticed that showcasing and having faculty present what has worked for them in their context can go a long way. And you're not asking anyone to make any change. You're just saying, here's what I did and here's how it worked. And I've found great success in it. So that modeling piece is one great strategy as well. Any other questions before we move on, or comments?
Hi, this is Maureen from Orange County Community College. I just wanted to make a comment. Maybe this is just something that happens in community colleges. Most of our faculty are adjuncts, and we're all feeling the technological fatigue, right, of the past year. So many things happening, right? It can be mentally exhausting. So trying to keep up with all the information and everything that we need to keep doing for our students and keep finding the ways to reaching out to them. It's not that prevalent, I think, definitely on my own campus. I know it's not. I love being part of SUNY because they are so good at getting this information to us. But I can only hope that a lot of my faculty are on something like this. So I know I appreciate every opportunity that we have to gather information and then share it. And I think as far as, I love Alex's analogy there of not being a fire hose, but what's great is so many of these ideas are just good ideas for human beings helping another human being to learn something, right? So listening carefully, finding out what's the best way that they learn. Do they understand things that they want to bring? We have so many different types of students and so many, backgrounds. So I think there are a lot of maybe non-threatening ideas that you could launch with and say, by the way, this also is from this whole thing of being, cultural responses, teaching. So I think that might be a gentle way to bring it forward to people who might not be as on top of all these topics anyway.
Thanks so much, Maureen. I appreciate that. That's great. So let's go back to the Padlet for a few more minutes. We already have some comments here, but I wanted to, again, not do the fire hose. So breaking this up into two different parts and focusing on the column for information processing and also the community of learners and learner environment. So how does providing an authentic opportunity to process content play out in your classroom? And connecting new content to culturally relevant examples and metaphors from students' community and everyday lives. How does that play out in your class? So you can just click the add comment button and give us your ideas that you've used or even questions about how you might consider doing it. All right, we've got some great stuff coming in here as well. I'm loving the behind the scenes comment. It's kind of behind the curtain, and placing commentary, right, about the why of what's happening in the course. Again, that helps with the transparency piece. I love connecting, let's see, read accounts of a phenomenon through different cultural lenses to see how the cultural habits and funds of knowledge impact the experience differently with different subgroups. I've also seen even STEM, classes in science or a statistics class saying, okay, what's happening in the community in real time that needs the support of a statistical analysis or a research piece, or even a proposal for something to be researched. Again, connecting to the local community. What kind of scanning of the local community can we do that might naturally connect to where students are living at the time? Allowing choice for project topics. That's a great one. Again, going back to John's comment, how can we instill that agency in students, motivating them. And sometimes they need some guidance around choosing that topic and not even knowing that they can think about their own culturally bound knowledge to play out into the course. Oh, love social annotation. I think, Alex, you've told me you've promoted Hypothesis, which is a great tool for social annotation. So allowing everybody to come to a digital space and make comments right there on the web. Hypothesis is a great tool for that, and you can create links directly to that conversation happening. I like to call that a digital field trip. What would it be like to send your students on a digital field trip to monitor a hashtag for a week based on an author or a concept or an idea in your course, and then come back and report it in the LMS, in the discussion forums. So I think about kind of how do we inhabit our digital spaces in a thriving and generative way, rather than a consumptive and numbing way. And classroom rituals, check-ins, reminders and updates, but also what did you take away from class today and what might be still a muddiest point that can then inform your next lecture or your next, the content of the next course. And Suni Coyle is here. International connections, international teams, which is a great opportunity to connect with other cultures in an even more direct way.
I think one helpful, thread that I'm seeing through all of this is the need to be transparent with students, the need to empower our students to play a really active role, not just in the experience of their learning, but in how we're structuring the course and how we're structuring the learning environment. Diane had chatted a couple of minutes ago and made a really good point. We need to be thinking here about the difference between good educational practice for all, and then how we enhance those practices to highlight the cultural aspect. Being clear about expectations is always good practice, totally agree, but focusing on cultural aspects such as making eye contact, questioning the expert, etc., validating these values while also setting up this environment we want in our course. So that's really important. And I think one reference that probably many of you are aware of, but I'll just point it out, is Marianne Winklemez, who's at Brandeis University in the Boston area, has done really wonderful work with, it's called TILT, Transparency in Learning and Teaching. And I think this gets at the point that Diane makes really nicely. So I'd encourage you, if you're not familiar with it, to look up TILT Higher Ed, and I'll post a link to that in the chat as well.
Also seeing some ideas around case studies, which is great, and that can be taken on so many different levels. Reflective pieces and the assignments, learning journals, again, that tie back to kind of goal setting and learning contracts is a great way to do learning journals. We also have been doing some work around equitizing your syllabus, and a lot of these ideas around reflective of learning can start right with setting the tone from the first day. So how can we in the syllabus actually be able to say, here's what we're inviting as in terms of a partnership, here's what we're inviting in terms of a learning community, and even just setting that stage before students sign up for the course if they get a chance to see the syllabus. That can be, again, looking at sort of the assets of the course and the assets of the digital spaces of your course. Where can these ideas be amplified, and signaled to the students to know what's going to be happening and what the expectations are for our course and what the opportunities and affordances are as well. It's making me think about that too. Any comments or questions for information processing, community of learners, or any of the columns that we presented today with this framework?
I think I'll come back for just a minute to the question that Hope raised earlier about the reactions we sometimes get from faculty who, especially right now in this current moment, are super overwhelmed, perhaps burned out. If not fully burned out, they are tired. And looking ahead, it's still a few solid months left in this academic year. And so to introduce practices or strategies, even if there's really significant evidence for how this can support student success, I think it's really understandable that people are going to hesitate before trying something new or testing yet another new approach in these next few months. And maybe there's even a barrier there if the encouragement to do that isn't coming from a peer in one's own department. So I think we do have to be really thoughtful about how we're introducing this information to our colleagues, how we're encouraging them. I think we have to look to our college or our university to leadership to support and invest in and validate the kinds of professional learning opportunities that we know are really helpful to support people in making these changes in their practice. And that would be true even in the most normal, much more relaxed environment of our pre-pandemic days, right? We needed those sorts of structures and reinforcements in our institutions to support faculty, to say it is important to devote some amount of time to ongoing growth in one's practice. My hope is that the kinds of time and energy people have invested over this last year to prepare themselves to teach fully online, when for many people they had not done that at all, or they had only done it very minimally. My hope is that, while people are exhausted, there's also a sense of tremendous accomplishment in what people have been able to do for their students in service of their student success to help through this, ongoing emergency. And so in the coming year, my hope is that people are able to continue on with that realization that, making these rather abrupt changes in their practice led to something positive, as difficult as it has been. And hopefully that continues to keep open the opportunities to continue to learn and to continue to test new approaches. I agree with Dean. He says we've got to start small with something easy and then add the next little bit and then the next and then the next.
Hi, this is Robin. I was wondering, John, you just shared a link in the chat to the TILT, Transparency in Learning and Teaching website. Can you talk a little bit more about that, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So this work comes from Marianne Winkelmez, who for years was at the University of Nevada, I think Las Vegas, and just moved to Brandeis University maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So this is a framework that involves relatively easy tweaks to what we do in our courses. And it's focused on being more open, more transparent with our students about the choices we are making. So if we think about this, one specific example is in how we design and frame assignments that we're giving to our students, whether that's an assignment they're going to complete during class time or a homework assignment, a paper, a project. Very often, we are clear as the instructor, and we take for granted why we're asking students to do something, what meaning that's going to have for their learning. And it's often far less clear to our students on the receiving end. So Winklemes has a framework that she asks people to think about what's the purpose of the assignment, what is actually the task we're asking students to complete, and what's the criteria for their success. So there's three pieces there: the purpose, the task, and the criteria. And on the website, she has really great examples across all different disciplines where she compares a less transparent version of an assignment and a more transparent version of the same assignment. And so the idea is these are really easy tweaks to make. She's got years of research studying the impact that faculty have had when they have introduced these transparent approaches in their courses. And again, what's great about this is that it does not involve redesigning and rebuilding a course from scratch. It really involves a series of minor tweaks to course design, to assignment design and presentation. And there are really positive effects for all students, but especially for students from underrepresented backgrounds when their instructors introduce these transparent practices. I will paste that URL once more, but again, it's called Transparency in Learning and Teaching, and the abbreviation is TILT Higher Ed.
Thank you. And I was digging around in it a little bit, and once you do get to the section that talks, that has some of the examples, it is fabulous that faculty can kind of pick those up as they are, and I'm assuming modify as necessary.
Yes,
right?
This is all, I mean, the resources are free. This is, not in any way a business for her. So she's all about having as many people as possible test out these approaches. And she's really interested in studying the impact. So in addition to the actual resources people can use and adapt in their classes, you'll also see a tremendous wealth of the research evidence for why it's helpful to take up these practices.
And she's also seeking faculty to help with her further research.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I only saw it a few minutes. I'm very impressed.
Yes. Yes.
I love it when assets become a repository for ideas, right? And a reference point to come back to, and then it becomes this iterative, capacity building on at really a national global level. Hope brought in a great idea about, putting CRT, culturally responsive teaching, in ADA compliance. What a fantastic way to infiltrate it. Makes so much sense to me. And it also, amplifies that notion of developing the whole student. There's resources there, there's staffing there at this point. I think that's a wonderful idea. And, obviously taking this to even to academic advising and really having people understand from the student success standpoint where we can amplify these ideas. And piggybacks well on UDL. Dean, thank you. Absolutely. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. Thank you all so much for your contributions, both into the Padlet and into the chat. Alex, I don't know if you are saving the chats. We certainly can do that and send that out as well. Or
yeah, that's
in the deck.
being handled, Susan.
Okay,
the chat saved. We're recording this, so all of those wonderful comments and resources will be in the chat. And of course, anyone can save the chat now if they like.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. This is our contact information. Feel free to reach out to us for other resources or ideas. I'm not super active on Twitter, although I probably should be, but our Twitter handles are on there as well. And thank you all so much again for your engagement and your time today. I hope this was useful, and we'll probably see you out there in some fashion. So thanks very much. And thank you, John.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's good to see my SUNY friends. See you again soon.